With much of the world currently locked down by the coronavirus pandemic, mathematical modelling has become a household talking point. To discuss this, I'm speaking with Kit Yates. He's a mathematical biologist at the University of Bath. In this ever-changing climate, it's probably also worth noting we recorded this interview on the 30th of March 2020.
By a mathematical biologist, I think people find that a bit of a strange one to deal with, because I think people think that typically maths is quite pure and abstract and biology is pretty messy and real world and never the twain shall meet. But really what I do day to day is take biological systems that I think are interesting, so maybe anything from a swarm of locusts to the way that eggs get their patterning or the way that embryos develop, and try and write down a system of equations or computer code which describe that to try and make predictions about those systems.
Kit, you say that people don't often see the link between biological systems and mathematics. I feel like that's changed pretty rapidly in the last few weeks.
Right. Everyone is talking about exponential growth, about epidemiological models, about modelling and basic reproduction numbers. Like Boris Johnson was talking about the fast upward tick of the curve. And even Conor McGregor, I saw the other day, was talking about implementing harsh measures to halt exponential growth of the disease in Ireland. So yeah, everyone is talking about mathematical biology at the moment. So it's a good time to be a mathematical biologist.
Is there a degree of that? I'm sure if you had a magic wand, you would make this all go away, and what a terrible thing this is for the world. But are mathematicians kind of thinking, at last, people get it?
Right, I think that's true. I think people, like, there's a good meme going around where it's just a guy standing at a chalkboard drawing an exponential curve and students saying, oh, when are we ever going to need this, right? And it's sort of the case. It sort of feels like, to some extent, a little bit of vindication, although, yeah, of course, ideally you would wish it away if you could do, but yeah, I think mathematicians are trying to make the most of this opportunity and to try and show people why maths really can be important. It can be a matter of life and death sometimes. So.
Do you feel like this has shown up sort of a problem with mathematical literacy, or do you think people have kind of risen to the occasion and they're getting it? Like, how have you felt about how well the public are understanding some of these things before we do start talking about them ourselves?
Yeah, I think people are doing an okay job, actually. I think the fact that people are even talking about it and caring about, how good these models are and asking these questions is a really good sign. I think it's a little bit difficult to explain all the really complex models that are out there at the moment, but I think that actually the basic mathematical models that underlie epidemiological spread are actually not too difficult to understand in fairly straightforward terms. And I think it's our job as maths communicators to try and make those things as understandable as possible. And I think there's a lot of good people out there working really hard to do that.
Where do we start? What is exponential growth?
Right, so technically the mathematical definition is when something grows in proportion to its current size, then that's exponential growth. Or equally, it could be something decaying in proportion to its current size. That's also exponential growth. So for exponential decay, you can imagine taking out a bag of M&Ms if you want, throw the M&Ms on your kitchen table on day one, and eat all the ones that land with the M side upwards, right? So roughly half the M&Ms will disappear. Put them back in the bag, save them for tomorrow, give them another shake out the next day, eat all the ones that have an M on them. And every day you'll be eating roughly half of the M&Ms. So the number of M&Ms is going to be decreasing in proportion to the number of M&Ms you have left, and therefore that you'll be getting an exponential decay of M&Ms over time. So something's decreasing in proportion, which means that the time it takes for it to halve or to decrease by a certain proportion will be the same no matter how much of that quantity you have. So that's exponential decay, at least.
So coronavirus, let's deal with that for a second. That's exponential growth.
At the moment, yeah. So the way the simplest mathematical epidemiological models work is you break the population down into three different compartments. They're called susceptible, so people who haven't had the disease; infective, so people who have the disease and can infect other people; and then we have this removed category. It's sort of a euphemistic term for people who have recovered, but also people that have died.
Right. This is the SIR model we hear talked about.
Right. We usually call it SIR, but yeah, SIR, whatever you want to call it, really.
Yeah.
At the very early stages, you have a whole bunch of people who are susceptible to the disease and very few people who are infected. And so each individual can go and infect a certain number of people who are susceptible. We call this the basic reproduction number of the disease. And if that number of people that they infect over the course of their infectious period is greater than 1, then they will on average infect that many people, who will then go and infect that many people again. So for COVID at the moment, estimates of the basic reproduction number are between 1.5 and 4, so it's quite a big window. But 2.5 is a generally sort of acceptable number. So the first person goes and infects 2.5 other people. They're going to infect 2.5 more and 2.5 more, and the exponential growth then occurs. You start to see the numbers growing exponentially.
The way people seem to be trying to get this across is, or the nature of it seems to be, it starts off as a slow trickle and then suddenly becomes like this huge waterfall. This
is the thing about exponential growth, right? I think people confuse it with being big or fast all the time. But actually, if you think about the amount of money in your bank account, or certainly my bank account, it's growing exponentially. You're getting interest proportional to how much money you've got, but the rate of interest is really low, so you don't really see that exponential growth properly. It's just really, really slow. If you left it long enough, then great, you'd get loads of money, but who can leave their money in the bank account long enough? And that's sort of what you see at the very start of the epidemic. You hardly notice these cases trickling in, and then all of a sudden it seems to just absolutely take off when the numbers start to really grow. And that's the sort of danger of exponential growth, is that if you don't recognize it early on, then you can think, oh, this isn't a big problem. And actually you really need to be acting on it and taking steps, which is what we're doing at the moment.
It's these grains of rice on a chessboard is the famous story, isn't it?
Right, exactly. So the king of the emperor of China rewards this guy for saving his life, and he comes along and says, you can have anything you want. And this farmer says, well, I'll just have 1 grain of rice for the first square on the chessboard, and 2 for the next, and 4 for the next. And if you can just complete that pattern, that would be great. And the emperor's like, well, yeah, whatever, that doesn't sound like very much. He could have had anything he wanted, and he chose this stupid amount of rice. And then, of course, it's doubling every time. Every time you put rice on the next square, it's more rice than you've already put on the whole of the rest of the chessboard. And so it turns out something like you'll have rice down to your knees or something across the whole surface of the earth in the end. So yeah, it's surprising. It's counterintuitive, if you like.
Do you think the public has gotten that now, or do you think we got it too late, or like just as an observer? I know you're not like a politician or like an expert, but it seems like, are people understanding this?
Yeah, I think the message is getting across to people, and I think people are starting to realise, as they're still seeing the numbers rise and rise day on day, we're still in this exponential growth phase. So deaths are doubling every 2 to 3 days. Cases are doubling every 3 to 4 days, so a little bit slower. But I think people are starting to get alarmed by the fact that, we're having 200 deaths a day and maybe more. And that's worrying them. And they're seeing the numbers go up, and not just go up in a linear fashion, but actually sort of doubling every 2 or 3 days. And I think people are starting to get the point and starting to realise that actually, because exponential growth can be so fast, anything that we can do early on can make a tremendous difference later on. Like, we can really change the numbers later on if we can just make small changes even now. And there was this nice infographic that went around that showed that if one person infected 2.5 people in 5 days, then after 30 days they would have infected 406 people. And actually, if you can reduce that by 50%, it changes from 406 to 15 people. And if you can reduce it even further by 75%, which is, there's some evidence that that's sort of what we're doing with our social distancing, you can reduce that number of total infected people to about 2.5, including the first person who was infected. So you can really wipe out this epidemic if you can reduce this spread enough.
So it's about getting that 2.5 number to something closer to your bank interest.
Right, exactly. If you can reduce even your bank interest, right, would be 0.5% per year, right? Even if we can reduce COVID spread to less than 100% during the course of their infectious period, then you'll start to get this exponential decline. If you can get it just below replicating itself, so just below 0%, then you'll start to see this exponential decline. But yeah, if we can bring it down to the rate of bank interest, then we'll start to see very, very slow exponential growth.
What kind of jobs are mathematicians doing at the moment? Like, I can see the job of doctors, and I can see the job of researchers trying to come up with vaccines. These graphs and models you're talking about have been known long before COVID came along, and they're being applied now. But are there day-to-day things mathematicians can be doing, like new work they can be doing to help in this battle?
Yeah, absolutely, because every disease is different, right? And these simple models that I've sort of described, this SIR model, they can be made infinitely more complex, right? So SIR is fine for some very simple diseases, but actually there's extensions that we can make to those SIR models to include things like a carrier class. So people who have the disease but aren't necessarily showing symptoms. So they're not necessarily showing, you wouldn't class them as infected because you don't know they're infected yet, but they've had this asymptomatic period, which is what's happening with COVID. And so they can be spreading it without you even knowing that they're infected. And that can be a real problem. And it has been a real problem with COVID because we can't just isolate people as soon as they show symptoms. We have to be isolating everyone in case they've got symptoms. So that's just one really simple extension you can make, but adding in things like noise, so stochasticity or randomness in the way that people bump into each other. Taking account of the networks with which people interact with each other can make a huge difference as well. You get these people who are social hubs and therefore will spread the disease to lots of people compared to people who are stuck at home and don't go out so much. So you can make these things arbitrarily complex, and there's actually been a call by the Royal Society for rapid assistance in modelling pandemics, where all mathematicians, especially applied mathematicians who have familiarity with modelling, can sign up and help out in this cause. So yeah, there's loads to be done at the moment, and we're keeping really busy.
Kit, how does someone build in something like these hub super spreader type people as opposed to people who are locked away? Like, I see that they exist, but how would you put them into a model, these sort of unmeasurables, I see you could guess at what they are, but then how do you?
So they're not necessarily unmeasurables. We actually know a lot about our social structure, in part from using social networking data, but also just there's been a number of studies done. And you can actually classify the way that people interact using a network. So people are nodes in that network and their connections to other people are edges. And so you can classify what's called the degree distribution of that network, which tells you how many people are there who have 100 contacts, how many people with 99, 98, and so on, down to how many people are there with no contacts. And that distribution can tell you a great deal about the way that people interact. So you can incorporate that network modelling into these SIR models. So you start the disease off in a particular node with a particular connectivity. How many people do they actually interact with? And you see how it spreads around the network. So they may seem almost intangible, but actually if we have good enough data, and this is what it all comes down to really, if we have good enough data, then we can actually capture these behaviours. But data at the moment on this emerging pandemic is really difficult to come by.
You talked about randomness, and I know that's a real expertise of yours. Can you give me an idea how randomness would feed into, for example, the coronavirus COVID situation? What are some of the random factors there, and how can mathematicians use them?
Well, so it's sort of interesting that actually in the what we call the deterministic models, so the models which don't have noise in them, if your basic reproduction number is above 1, then your epidemic definitely takes off, even if it's only a tiny amount above 1. And if it's below 1, then it definitely dies off. But actually in models which build in noise or stochasticity, you can tolerate being slightly above that threshold of R0, because in reality, not everyone has the same number of contacts with everyone. There's noise, and not every contact with someone else passes the disease on. So actually, in reality, you can actually have a non-zero probability of the disease dying out without having a big epidemic, even if you have this basic reproduction number being above 0 in the deterministic model. Whereas, in the deterministic model, it says it definitely takes off and then it dies out. But when you build in noise, you actually realise that we can tolerate a little bit of spread above this basic reproduction number of 1.
One of the things I've found interesting has been the use of graphs where the y-axis has been logarithmic, I think. So they take away that dramatic curve and everything becomes straight lines. And it's been used a lot comparing the spread in different countries. But there's something about those graphs that I somehow find deceptive. Like, I know you're a mathematician, you must look at them and you can straight away process it. But what do you think of the use of those graphs?
I don't think they're super helpful, actually. I was actually reading the comments below the line, which you should obviously never do, on a BBC article the other day, which showed these log, or what are called semi-log plots. So you have a log axis so that you can really see how things are changing. The problem with having with a linear axis is you don't really see what was happening early on. It just looks like 0 cases, then all of a sudden it blows up. Whereas the log, you get this nice sort of straight line, and it tells you what the exponent is, how quickly things are growing, which is useful if you're studying the disease. But actually, the comments below the line were people like saying, well, there's clearly some mistake in this graph, because the space between 10 and 100 is the same as the space between 100 and 1,000. And that, I mean, that's the point of a log plot, but it's not actually that helpful unless you know something about logarithms. So for me, I would steer away from those a little bit. Yeah.
I mean, I'm no expert, but I think I agree with you on that. There's something almost like it makes it look like it makes the growth look so steady and calm when it's a straight line. You think, oh well, if we do something now, it'll be all right. But like it doesn't show how it's running away from you.
No, and you compare the different number of countries' cases, and when you see it on a log plot, you're like, oh, America's not very far ahead of us. I thought they were doing really badly, and actually, like they are doing pretty. They've got a lot more cases than us on an exponential, on a linear scale. It does look pretty bad, but on the log plot, it doesn't really look like they're that far ahead of us. But yeah, it can be deceptive. So I would steer away from using the log plots a bit, I think.
As a mathematician, but as also like a human who, doesn't want coronavirus to be terrible, what are some of the numbers and graphs and things that you're looking at most closely and that you're really interested in and that you're really hoping change or get dealt with?
Right. So since we've had lockdown for about a week in the UK at the moment, and actually it's sort of too soon to really tell what impact that's having, but even today we've been seeing the number of hospitalizations has gone down slightly, the daily number of hospitalizations, that is, and similarly the number of cases that are being reported is going down. Now you can't read too much into that, because actually not everyone is being tested. People are being urged to stay at home if they have mild symptoms, which is really sensible, and so we're not testing everyone, so you can't read too much into it. But it's hinting that some of the early measures that we took, like telling people to work from home and banning gatherings, are having an impact. It's a bit too early to tell the impact of the lockdown yet, and certainly like deaths is the figure that you really want to look at, because deaths, you report all the deaths, you don't miss any of those cases, right? But actually we won't really see the impact of the lockdown on deaths for probably a couple of weeks, because there is this long period that you're ill for before you get seriously ill and then potentially go on and die. So but those are the really important figures, is looking at case numbers and looking at number of deaths, and once we start to control those and bring those down, then we know that the impact of the effect of the lockdown and the measures that we've been taking to control the disease.
I mean, what numbers can we give mathematicians other than positive tests and deaths?
Yeah, that's the tricky thing really at the moment. There's a group led by a guy called John Edwards who are looking at other measures, so encouraging people to log how they are interacting with each other, and so trying to figure out what the basic reproduction number would be if they were just talking to each other.
Of course, another piece of data is people going into intensive care, I guess, and things like that, and ventilation and stuff. But
yeah, so hospitalization data is something it's useful, because you don't go to hospital unless you're really serious, and we can measure those numbers, but it's not part of the data that's officially released by Public Health England every day. But it can give us an indication, as it already is doing, because the numbers are coming down a little bit per day, that the effect of the measures that we've been taking are generally having some effect, at least.
So as mathematicians produce different models and things like that they can then give to policymakers, what are the levers the policymakers have? Like, is it just this, level of how draconian we're stopped from bumping into each other? Like, what other levers can policymakers pull?
Yeah, I think unfortunately that's it. Basically, it can only be how much more lockdown we have at the moment. One thing that seems to be really important is getting this antibody test out to find out who's had the disease. So there was this talk early on from Boris Johnson about herd immunity, and so this is a mathematical idea really, where if you have enough people in the population who have had the disease and are then immune to it, then you can effectively wipe out the spread of that disease to the people who are more vulnerable and more at danger if they do get the disease. And so actually there's a relationship directly between the basic reproduction number of the disease, so how many infections one single infected person will spread to over the course of their infectious period, and this ratio of how many people you have to have in order to get herd immunity. And it's just 1 minus 1 divided by the basic reproduction number. So if the basic reproduction number is 4, then you have to have 1 minus a quarter or 3/4 of the population immune to the disease before you effectively wipe it out. Ideally, we would develop a vaccine so we could just get lots of people immune from the disease by vaccinating them. But actually, the alternative way to get herd immunity is by having the disease. Obviously, if everyone gets it, then that's going to be awful. But if we could get healthier demographics, younger demographics to have the disease, enough people to have it very mildly that we could have that fraction of the population immune, then potentially that's a strategy for taking the disease out. But in terms of what the government can actually do without putting huge numbers of lives at risk, it's locking down further, stopping people going out for exercise, putting roadblocks in cities, stopping people from going on long journeys. So yeah, there's not much further we can go, I guess, but we could still go further. And unfortunately, those are the only measures that are open to us without a vaccine at the moment.
This herd immunity idea was quite controversial at the time, though, isn't it? Because there is this sort of feeling of lambs to the slaughter. Let's deliberately let our people get it for the greater good. And I sometimes have felt this way myself, that sometimes when we talk about it all so mathematically, we kind of forget that these are all human beings who are like suffering as a result. As a mathematician, how do you feel about that? Because I see that the pleasure you get from the models and the mathematics of it, but at the same time, there's this sort of very human element to it.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it was hugely controversial. It still is hugely controversial, and I'm not advocating this strategy of herd immunity as one that's a good way to go in this situation. Yeah, I think that's partly why I decided to be a mathematical biologist in the first place, was because I thought I got to uni doing maths and I thought, when is this going to be useful to people, right? And then I realised that actually you could use maths to describe biology, and for me that was amazing because from a very early age, I decided I wanted to be a scientist. My mum died from cervical cancer, and I remember kids laughing at me at school when I was 10 years old because I was like, I want to be a scientist, and they were like, I want to be a footballer. I was like, okay, right. But so like when I got to uni and did maths and found that I could use maths to describe the real world and to describe biology, that was massive for me because I thought, well, I can actually have an impact on real people's lives and make a difference. And I think that's at the heart of all the modelling that we're trying to do, is not to forget that actually these models describe real people. It's super important for us not to forget that.
I mean, it seems pretty obvious that this pandemic's going to leave a scar on the world and have some kind of long-lasting effect. What about mathematically? Do you think it's going to have a mathematical legacy? Is it going to, because I've never seen mathematics being talked about so much with a global news event.
I hope it will draw people into mathematics and make people realise that, if you become a mathematician, you can have a real impact on the world. You're not just sat behind a desk writing a textbook for a subject which is dead and gone. You're actually living in the real world, and you're doing things which can have a real important impact on people's lives. So I hope that future generations of kids who are studying maths in school at the moment will say, wow, this is actually this living, breathing, exciting subject, and I want to be part of that. And so I hope we'll get more people into mathematics. And I also hope that people will take maths a little bit more seriously themselves. So maths generally only gets in the news when it's, the Fields Medals times and people struggle to understand the very complicated maths that the Fields Medalists have won the maths for. But actually, at the moment we can tell people about relatively straightforward mathematical models which are having a huge impact on their everyday lives, as suggesting how we have come to this unprecedented lockdown that we've never seen before. So hopefully it will have a really big impact on people's lives.
Kit, is there a cutting edge here though? Is there new mathematics to be discovered and found here, or is this basically pretty relatively simple mathematics and statistics just being applied in clever and new ways with more data and more tweaks? Is there a discovery or new types of mathematics that a genius could come along and change things?
I mean, I have to say I'm a very sort of Luddite mathematician. I like using tools that are already there. So I'm not working at the cutting edge of developing new mathematical tools. I like to know that someone knows that there's existence and uniqueness for certain problems, but it doesn't have to be me. So I'm probably the wrong person to ask that question to. But but as far as I'm aware, it's people applying tools in a new way. So it's tools that already exist, mathematical models that we've been developing for a number of years, but actually applying them to new situations and trying to get new insights from that.
Can you just lastly tell me a little bit more about this Royal Society project? What is this? Is this like a sort of all hands to the pump type thing? Or?
Right, exactly. It's sort of like, in Lord of the Rings when Aragorn runs in and says, Gondor calls for aid, and everyone stands up and says, this is amazing. So yeah, it's this call from the Royal Society. It came out over the weekend. They are asking people, mainly at universities, research-intensive universities, to put proposals forward with their group and to volunteer what amount of time they can and what expertise they have, including PhD students, postdocs and tenured faculty members to try and put forward their expertise and to offer it and to hopefully try and organise it. So there's a lot of sort of individual modelling efforts, people going off and doing their own thing, but actually we can work much better as a group as long as someone organises it effectively, and that's what the Royal Society are trying to do. So our research group, the Centre for Mathematical Biology in Bath, are putting together our proposal, which we're going to send off tomorrow, and we're going to contribute as much of our time as we can to help fight this.
And I know it's just a proposal, but can you, just so I understand how you can even help, give me some like vague idea as to what that proposal looks like, what you propose?
Yeah, so they're asking, at the moment, they're just asking for ideas of what your background expertise is and how you think that might be useful. So for me, I have expertise in doing stochastic models, random models of multi-particle systems, multi-agent systems, so they're often called individual-based models, and these can be really useful for understanding epidemic spread, potentially at a very fine-grained level, so looking at literal interactions between people rather than thinking of everyone as this huge population in this SIR model. So that's the sort of thing that I'll be putting down. But we have other people in Bath who are traditional epidemiologists who have expertise in things called household models, where you break down populations into households and you look at the effect of the different sizes of households and how people move between their local neighbourhoods. So there's all sorts of things that we're trying to do, but that's the idea of the response in Bath at the moment.
If someone was listening to this who wasn't a mathematician and is sort of following what's going on with a degree of fear and bewilderment, but also interest, what do you want them to understand? What would you say to them if you could say anything to them? Right.
I think that if exponential growth teaches us anything particularly about this disease spread, it's that the earlier you make your interventions and the tighter you do them, the more you adhere to these rules that have been put in place, the bigger that you'll see this impact having. Within a few weeks, within even a few days, it will make a huge difference. So now is the time to be, so to speak, doubling down on our efforts to lockdown so that we don't double up on number of cases, if you like. So yeah, really taking that exponential growth message to heart.
Thank you for your time, and hopefully you get involved in more work to help us all out.
Great, thanks Brady, it's been a pleasure.
Well, that's it for today, but I'm going to include some links to various resources and videos in the description for the podcast. Among them will be a video we did with Ben Sparks on Numberphile, in which he explained that SIR model. You can find out more about Numberphile at our website, that's numberphile.com, or you can find us on YouTube pretty much just by typing in Numberphile. I'm Brady Haran. I look forward to catching you again soon, and in the meantime, please stay safe.